All right, well, welcome to what we call judicial roundtables, or in this case, judicial circles. The whole idea here is for each of us to share our experiences about being a judge, and in particular, the emotional experiences and challenges of being a judge because of the burdens that we all face, whether they be just dealing with difficult issues, difficult lawyers, difficult media, whatnot, the pressures of the job, and hopefully we can learn from one another, your life experiences as a judge and how you have used strategies to deal with the stresses of the job. And what we have to remember too, I think, is that there's a great secret out there that we shouldn't let out, but I'm going to go ahead and let it out. Judges are human. And as a result, they have their own families, their own personal lives, and their own personal challenges that they can't take to the bench because we expect them to sit there and with the greatest poker face, not show any emotion in the highly emotional charged cases, and all that weighs on the judges. And as we know, nobody knows the weight of another person's burdens. So it's important for us to have these discussions and help one another out by sharing our experiences as judges. The format is pretty simple. We have some questions that we will ask. I will serve as your moderator. Good luck. I will ask the question. Each one of you will get a chance to answer that question. Take up to about 5 minutes to answer the question, just so that we're sure that everybody gets a chance to comment or respond, and then we can discuss the question. If there's a need for further discussion, then we'll move on to the second question. Very simple format. All right?
Sounds good.
All right, well, let me open up with the first question. How do people closest to you know when you are feeling stressed, overwhelmed, or overburdened? Angela, you want to start?
Well, you know, it's interesting because there are different perceptions of my reaction to stress from my family members. So I would think that I get withdrawn, kind of quiet. I don't focus on other things. I'm so busy internalizing the anxiety and the stress. The perception of my family is that I can get angry. And so it's different. I felt that I'm a worrier. And so, you know, I'm the kind of person that I'll take that anxiety and keep it to myself, and then at night not be able to sleep because you're thinking of a decision, you know, that you made. Did I do it right? Did I do the right thing? And so that's how I felt that I internalized it. But when my family said, well, no, sometimes you can get a little angry, you know, irritable in your reactions to, you know, family situations. That was a surprise to me because I didn't realize that I responded that way. So it was just interesting to me that when I asked, what do you think, how do I act when I'm stressed out or anxious? And so you get a little angry, and I was thinking, I kind of quietly went off and thought about it. And so that in and of itself, it seems like, you know, sometimes you don't even know how you respond. You know, you may respond, I guess, different ways at different times.
Well, I found the same experience with my family was that I didn't think I acted any differently, but apparently I did. It was the short temper, the being tired. You know, after a particularly difficult week, just not having any energy to do anything with the family, and then the shortness with people, the anger that, you know, normally I would not act that way, but because I was stressed out, I would snap at people. And again, I didn't realize that was happening. So sort of the same kind of reaction that your family had. Yeah.
I don't think I've got any. I react almost exactly the same way. The one thing I would add is that I tend to eat a lot of like junk food and you know, high carbs when I get really stressed out. But I think it's hard for people who I'm closest to know what's really going on with me because I withdraw, and I almost don't want them to probe. I'd rather kind of, go figure it out myself, and I think that can be really difficult for them.
I also internalized a lot of the stress, but I was surprised. My wife told me that I would have a tendency, I would internalize, but then I would talk a lot. So if I was after a case that was particularly stressful, I would discuss the case and all its subtleties, legal issues. She had no idea what I was talking about, but would listen, wouldn't comment. The other thing, I would tap, apparently. I would have a nervous tick. I spoke to my TCAA recently about this, and she said, and I didn't remember this, but after a stressful sentencing, I would close the door of my chambers, and then eventually she would have to come in, and she would say I would just be staring off the space. And then we talk, same thing with my wife can calm me down, but it wasn't too often, but it would occur.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I wanted to just say one more thing. I think sometimes I'll make things not seem as serious as they are, like a joking, laughing it off kind of a thing, when I'm not really feeling that.
Well, that's a good reminder. I certainly would do that.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because the four of you knew that you were internalizing, right? And we as judges are pretty much told you don't share information with anybody, everything's confidential. So do you think that in some respects it's the system that has almost forced you to internalize?
I think so, but there's a good reason for it, to not be discussing things. Like, I could not discuss details of a case with friends that I have, who I socialize with, but I think your spouse is someone that you can talk about, but try to avoid getting into anything that is confidential. But there's a good reason for it, and I think what we have to do is find other outlets of how to deal with that internalism that you're doing, the techniques to get over it.
Well, how would you know, Angela, when you were actually internalizing a stress of the day?
Well, I would know because I find myself like going to a room, and then because I was so focused and thinking about the decision I made and the reactions to it and worrying about, perceptions of it, and realized I'd forgotten why I came into the room, and I wasn't senile yet. So I knew it was a result of the stress and the anxiety. So I could tell, or couldn't sleep, would be tossing and turning at night, and knew, because I would just kept going back to the decision that was made. And, so I knew when I was worrying about something. It manifested itself pretty well.
Yeah, and how did you discover that your family perceived your handling of the pressures different than what you perceived it?
Because I guess my reaction, to something, just a family situation, I'd be short, and that's not me, normally. I'm pretty even keel. And so when I would say, I guess I didn't realize I was doing it. I thought I was being myself, but they would say, look at me. All of a sudden I'd see my kids and Tommy looking at me like, and then I realized I'd said something or done something. But for me, it was an aberration. I didn't realize that it could be a pattern after a while. And so gradually I realized I do have the capability of letting it out that way. So it was a learning experience.
Yeah, whether you intended to or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve?
Well, my wife was not one to hesitate to give me feedback. So, but she was very understanding, because I'd go off on my own, and she understood that. But she knew when I was under stress, if I'd go to the shop, do some woodworking, or just sit there and stare at things. But, and I think the family just recognized that they didn't have to say anything.
How would you deal with it, Wendy?
How would I deal with it?
Knowing that your family's perception
Right.
of how well you were dealing with the stress is very
Right.
different from yours.
Right. I think I really have worked on trying to be more vulnerable because that's not been a thing that's been easy for me, both the way I was raised, but also as a woman lawyer. You know, you don't really want to show weakness or that these things are getting to you, you know. And so I think I just tried to be more aware of that whole issue, and instead of lashing out, trying to articulate, okay, what's going on before I lashed out. Like, I'm really stressed out at work and that kind of thing, but it's not easy, and I still have work to do in that regard.
And it's interesting because, you know, I'm the oldest of 9. And so I always thought that I would actually enjoy having to be alone and be isolated. I thought, this is going to be great. You know, I can deal with anybody. But it's a really different kind of isolation. You know, it's different when you choose to go somewhere and relax and be by yourself and not deal with conflict and things like that. But when you feel like you have to, it's a whole different kind of isolation. It feels like you don't have any choice but to, you know, you can't socialize with these people publicly because of the perception of bias. You can't discuss anything for fear that might, you know, that is confidential and can't get out. You have to sit on the bench and have a complete poker face, you know, when real interesting things are going on in front of you. And it just, after a while, it's not relaxing. It's not enjoyable. It can be depressing, you know, when you don't see your colleagues all day. You go in, you make decisions, next thing you know, you're going out, and all of that stuff is walking out with you. So it's a very different type of isolation, you know, that judges have than just being alone. It's a pressure, actually.
It's a
And you know-
chatterbox.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
The chatterbox in the mind.
exactly. It's all in there, you know, and then,
You were going to say something, Wendy?
Yeah, I was going to say the other isolation that I felt was when I would go to events, like bar events or whatever, I felt like the interactions I had with lawyers were not so real anymore, that they were laughing at my jokes and that weren't that funny, and, you know, that whole kind of thing. And so that was really isolating because you didn't have as many authentic conversations with people who used to be your friends.
no, I agree. That was one big difference.
As a man, it was interesting. As a woman, what you said you didn't want to show, or you felt that you didn't want to show emotions. And of course, as a man, I think I was brought up not to show too much emotion myself.
Right.
So I think it came out of me with humor, or what I thought was humor. Judge B. Hill, who was next to me for 12 years on the criminal bench, spoke at my retirement and said he would tell these stories and I never understood them. So unlike the attorneys who would act like they understood them.
Yeah.
I was waiting for the punchline.
That was hours ago.
Yeah. Mike, you had mentioned that we need to look for strategies for other ways to deal with the pressures. How would you decide to deal with the pressures?
You know, the surefire way is to retire. But short of that, I found that presiding over the specialty courts, the drug court and the treatment court, were really helpful to me because you wear a different hat in those courts. You're not the person with the hammer up there waiting to come down on people. You're more involved in what's happening in these people's lives and your interactions with them during the court proceeding. is more human than it is in the courtroom. You're able to say, well, I understand you suffered a loss in your family and you relapsed, and you're able to have this discussion and not only be the enforcer, but also be the cheerleader. And that always made me feel good. After I completed a drug court session or a treatment court session, I felt calmer, I felt more relaxed, and that helped a lot. The other thing, being from Santa Fe, I didn't try crystals, but I did try meditation. Worked really, really well for me. In the morning before I went to work, a brief 10 to 15 minute meditation period, and I always got up way earlier than the rest of the family, so I was able to do that in solitude, and it really was helpful. It cleared my mind, relaxed me, and I was ready to go through the day. And in the evening, meditation was also helpful. Before I interacted with the family, I'd come home, go back to my bedroom, and another 10 or 15 minutes, and you sort of clear out a little bit, and you're calmer, and that seemed to work for me. In the first district, Judge Pfeffer here was real helpful because he was right next door. So we were able to talk to each other, not only about cases, but just about whatever. When we had a break, it wasn't often. So that was really helpful. And when your bench is collegial, you can do that with a lot of judges. It was not always collegial in the first, but when it was really, really helpful to be able to go and speak to other judges. One of the judges I went to high school with, so we were friends before we even became lawyers, so that was helpful. And the other thing that helped in the first district was we had these retreats where we would all gather together and leave the courthouse, and we would go to a relaxing place, and we were able to talk not only about issues facing the court, but also just interact socially, and that was helpful.
In fact, there were budget issues that came up where that stopped, but I think was a very important thing. I think it'd be good if the court started that again, because it did form a good friendship among the judges. Also, being able to discuss cases. I don't know if Angela remembers, I called her when I took over part of the domestic docket, which was an alien thing to me, and I called her, and she was quick to get on the phone, and there was kind of an unspoken rule on the first that we would get off the bench as quickly as possible if there was a question, if one of the judges was having difficulties, so that was a good thing. For me, there are different kind of stresses, though, on the job. There's stresses of the workload, stress, and then there's, I think you have to develop a way to address that. Then there's stresses, of course, from criminal cases on how you've handled some human beings. So for me, on the workload, especially when I was handling a lot of civil actions, you build up piles. My wife had been in association management. She had me read a book, or it was kind of a pamphlet called The 1 Minute Manager, and that really served me well. It's just like you address the pile. You don't put this one to the side. You just take them as they come. And I think if I would recommend this pamphlet, but if you handle that, the piles that's one kind of stress. And then with the criminal, I remember early on when I went on the criminal bench and I handled a murder trial, and I sentenced this young fellow. He would never get out. And I felt the sentence was appropriate, what had happened, but it had more, I felt more emotion about it than I realized. For about 2 weeks, I would periodically, it would come upon me in a very emotional way, and I wondered if I would be able to do the job. And And I think I went on vacation, that kind of settled in, and I think it's just time. And you never get used to sentencing to a certain degree because you're handling everybody differently, but I think I put it more in perspective after that. So that was a thing I learned in that direction.
Yeah, you seem to be able to relate to that, Angela.
Yeah, I mean, I was just following up with Judge Vigil. I remember that I kind of have a unique stress reliever in that my husband was a district court judge, and so much to the dismay of my children, especially when they were teenagers, you know, we would talk about our cases with each other and all of the, you know, the decisions we had to make. And he was children's court, I was family court, so many times he was seeing the children of the parents that I was dealing with, because that's the nature of those two courts. It's all family. And so that helped me a lot, because he understood, you know, the isolation. He understood in family cases, there's so much discretion, you know, unlike the other courts where there's more rules and regulations and strict procedures. You know, we have child support guidelines. We have what's in the best interest of the child. We have alimony guidelines. I mean, we were always doing much more equity than the other courts. And so those decisions were really agonizing sometimes, because it really was based on who you believed and your perception of things. It's just, so we talked about that a lot, and that really helped. Just having someone who understood what you were going through to talk back and forth, and that kind of relieved, was a relief. Exercise for me was a big reliever, because I like to run, and you're alone.
Back
Your
to
mind,
being alone.
you could just go on rote, you know, and just run into the sunset while you're thinking about a case. So that was always a good relief. And then just, you know, when my kids were growing up, you walked in the door and there's a whole different set of things you had to think about. So that in and of itself was an instant, you know, relief, because you were focused on something else. I guess the problem there is finally when those issues were dealt with and you were going to bed, for example, here it comes back. And so, you know, it's really important to have some form, some type of something else that can relieve it. And I think communication with other judges is a big one, because they're the only ones that understand what you're really going through. So I think communication is really one of the better ones.
Well, the physical activity you talked about was very important to me. I think that's important. And having something on the side, I was a woodworker and took a number of courses on woodworking and sculpture and at the community college, so that was a lucky asset in Santa Fe. And then you get in with another group, so you kind of forget about what you're doing on the job. There's a certain camaraderie in those courses, so that was very helpful to me.
Yeah, so Wendy, the question is, if I was being formal, what did you do to manage the stress or isolation of the job?
One of the things, and I know this has happened to a lot of judges, is I had a decision, probably the most difficult thing I had to deal with as a judge was a decision that got some very negative publicity. And that was extremely difficult. And probably for everybody, we are all like good students, and all of a sudden to be on the front page of the Journal. And what happened in my case was that, and now I can laugh about it, but at the time I did not think I could. I didn't really realize that the press had come to my house until I was watching the 10 o'clock news and I see my front door. And I'm like, oh my God. But anyway, I don't think I did handle that very well, looking back on it, because it was difficult for me to ask for help. And I think, I hope that I would be better now. And I don't know if you all may not have read Brene Brown, but she talks about shame hides in the dark. And I felt like I had done something wrong. Looking back on it, it was just the nature of the job that you make a decision and the press doesn't like it for whatever reason, and there you are, but you feel, you know, I can remember like wearing dark glasses and I didn't want to see anybody and all that kind of thing. So I'm not sure I did do a very good job in that regard.
Well, thinking about it in retrospect, how do you think you would handle it now?
I would hope that I would share with my colleagues more about what was going on, because I think, I mean, I had Angela. She would have been a great colleague for me to wander down the hall and say, you know, and cry even about it, because it was so hard, you know, but I didn't really. I kind of went into problem-solving mode without dealing with the emotional aspect of that whole thing.
And that's a big stressor. That was one of my big stressors, was the press, because I'm a very private person. You know, I don't think anybody wants their private life out there, you know, or decisions you make to be sort of dissected and one aspect of it given, you know, given to the public. And so that was a real hard stressor, to having your cases, you know, out there. I remember one headline, Judge Jewell gives a child to the abuser, you know, that one, or where they're picketing in front of the courthouse with signs, you know, saying about our cases. I mean, but that's where we all talked about, the family court judges, because at some point in time, we were all a target of someone. Yeah. And so that's where talking to each other was very helpful, because we were all pretty much usually in the press for one or other of our cases, and so it was real helpful to talk to each other. And that was a painful, very painful part of being a judge, is the fact that your life is out there, you know, and you either develop a thick skin and or not. So you have to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah, but how does one develop thick skin?
I've never developed a thick skin.
That was aspirational.
I would talk to my husband, who has a very thick skin, and you know, he just say, Andy, this is part of the job. You know that you're the only one that knows what was in front of you when you made that decision. If you feel like you made a right decision, move on. Nope. I would think about it. Should I have done? Should I? It's just your personality. You know, we each bring our personality to the bench, and that's why I think talking about it is helpful, because you're really the only one that has to learn how to live with your decision. No matter how much you talk to everybody, and at some point you have to get to the realization, this is this job. You know, you can't let it change you. You just have to keep going. You know, next case, you know, and move on. It's just hard to get there.
You know, the physical activity is a good stress releaser, and all my life I've loved hiking, and that really helped on weekends when I could take off with my friends who I would hike with and just spend 3 hours in the mountains. That was really helpful. Mm-hmm. What was really hard for me, and I never was able to figure out how to deal with this, is when threats were made against you as a judge, and unfortunately the newspapers picked it up, and your children get worried because someone has threatened to kill you. And then they place a police car outside of my house all night, you know, until because the police felt it was a credible threat. That was hard. It was hard, and I tried to sit down with my family and tell them that everything's going to be okay. You know, they just have to investigate it and go through the process, and tried to calm them down. I don't think I did a real good job.
I'm glad you brought that up, though, because Judge Behill was threatened his life, and I was threatened with my life, and they put a close observation with police cars around my home. For him, they put a sniper on the roof.
Yes.
I never understood the difference.
Yeah.
he was a little safer. So, but I did have our court administrator called one time. I was out of town and said, somebody had called the clerk's office and said they were going to kill me. And I asked him if the clerk had told them that I was on vacation, but Judge Behill was.
Oh, no.
So, but it was pretty shocking to my wife when all of a sudden
Right.
cars started coming around the house, so I had to learn to call her up in advance that this was about to happen.
Yeah.
Well, that makes dealing with bad press seem like it's not as bad, huh?
Not too bad. The press, what I learned was, nobody likes bad press, and I would get it periodically also, but I did learn that the press kind of likes one-liners or kind of catchphrases that they can't resist. So for me, I was going to give a fellow a conditional discharge, and I knew that, and I knew that wouldn't go over because sometimes the public through the press is ready to want you to install a rafter in your courtroom, just throw the rope over the rafter and get on with it. So in this case, where they had the press in, and I knew the victims had contacted the press, when it was my turn to speak, I said, it's not my job to destroy lives, and the press couldn't resist that. So I learned to some degree, if you can come up with that catchphrase, sometimes you're going to do the right thing, but it can kind of smooth out some of the bad reaction.
I remember a judge, right when I took the bench, he said, if you're going to make a controversial decision, make it the day after the election.
Certainly after retention.
You know, something I did with the press is different reporters would have the courthouse beat. And when a new reporter would come in, I would invite him back to my chambers, introduce myself, and sort of talk with them about the process and explain to them that I can't comment on a case that's pending in front of me. But if you ever have questions about procedure or something that you don't understand that the court has done, I can explain what the procedure is. I can't comment about the sentence or anything like that. And that worked really well. I think I got more favorable press from some of these reporters. Yeah, you still had the problem of their going for that catch line. Like the time I told a child molester who was quoting the Bible to me, and they say, "You're probably going to rot in hell." Headline the next day was, "Judge sentences molester to hell."
Oh, my.
Well, you can't go wrong with that.
I think they like that.
You know, but Angela said a thing before that I've been thinking about, the sleeping.
Yeah.
And that would certainly get me periodically. I would, the pressure comes out at night. For me, I found that certain books would help me in that case. Sometimes light reading, but often something that I found inspirational. I know when I was first appointed, I was learning the job, and at the same time I had to run for election. It was very stressful, and it was affecting sleep. And I was reading a book on speeches by Lincoln called Lincoln on Democracy, and it would kind of put me in a different state at the time, kind of calm me down, because it was like bigger issues. But sleep is an issue.
One of the particular stressors for me is, you know, everybody likes to be liked, and some of us like to be liked more than others. But for some reason, you know, you just want people to have a good opinion of you, and I guess that's one of my strong quirks, that once I had a bad press issue, you know, where they were saying negative things about me in the press, I found that the next day when I got on the bench, I was starting to weigh that in my decisions. For a split second, I mean, I found myself saying, ooh, you know, I'm going to make another negative decision. Maybe I shouldn't do that. I actually had that thought, and it scared me to death because, you know, once you start thinking like that,
Right.
then you're no longer neutral or fair or impartial. So I really had to just, you know, focus on what was in front of me and just say, just ignore, you know, the camera in the courtroom or whatever. Just ignore the other voices and make your decision no matter, you know, what the perception's going to be. And then sometimes I got a rebellious streak and said, I'm going to go in the opposite direction just to show that I'm being neutral. I mean, it was all over the place, you know, the thoughts that go through your mind with all of these extrinsic, that's the word I was looking for, the outside sources around you. So the job was to just focus, you know, just make your decision based on this, and everything else is noise, you know, don't listen to it. I mean, I had to work on that for a while after my first big paper, you know, debut. After a while, it just got to be okay. You're just going to get that.
Anybody else have ideas for how you turn off the chatterbox?
I know reading helped me a lot. I mean, just go into another world. I just read and go somewhere else. You know, sometimes that helps a
I
lot.
think exercise is
And
really,
exercise is
really
important, too.
important. Everybody said that.
I remember I tried yoga one time. I thought, well, this ought to be good. And then I found I couldn't relax. I couldn't even relax to relax. I just said, just said back to running.
Well, all right. Anybody else wants to add to the discussion? Talk about maybe other stressors that you experienced as judges and how you dealt with it?
You know, Angela made me think about judges are so measured now with the judicial performance evaluations in Albuquerque. There's the Albuquerque Bar Survey, and they measure your demeanor and everything. I think that's a real stress because sometimes you can't help but get extremely irritated and I remember getting really irritated, and then at night I'd go home and go, oh no, I would feel worse about that. But there were certain and we would talk about, like, if we could get 10 lawyers that we never saw again in the courtroom. We all pretty much agreed who they would be, but that's, I think, a lot of stress because your range, the acceptable range of behavior for judges is so narrow, and you are always being measured.
Oh, yeah, evaluated.
Evaluated, yeah.
Anybody else? Well, before we leave, I'd like to know, how was this experience of sitting in a judicial circle for you?
Well, being surrounded by fellow judges, that feels good. You know, you feel like you're amongst people that understand what you've been through and your job. And I think it's really helpful to know that you can do this, that you know you can talk to others, because then you don't feel so alone. You know, sometimes you feel like I'm the only one going through this, and just by being in a group, you feel like no, I'm not alone, and that's a big help.
I think it's a good reminder that, I mean, we all know that all of us are under stress, but it's a reminder to hear from others that they're going through it also, and some of the things that each one has said brought back memories to me. So I think that is kind of cathartic to be able to sit down and do that. Of course, I'm also retired. And, so, as Judge Behill said, that handles a lot of issues, but I think it would have been helpful. There are, not constantly, but periodically when I was on the bench, something like this would have been helpful. There, just every once in a while. But we also, we had our colleagues, and I think some of us, there was always a few people we had good rapport with, and I think that's helpful. But there were a few times I think it would have been helpful to be able to open up in a private situation.
You know, I had a thought that I think this would be really helpful for new judges coming on, because when they come on, I have this specific instance in mind. new judge who I knew before I was coming out of the courthouse. She was so excited. She was energetic. You know, she looked like youthful. You know, you could just see the glow, ready to go. 6 months later, I was coming out, and she was going in, and I mean, it was like night and day. And she just said, I don't know how you did this for so long. I mean, and you go in not realizing the isolation, and you know, you don't know that. So to get that right away, to get some kind of, well, for us, it's debriefing. For them, what do you call it? Where you training to understand. You might be going through this, and here's some tools to help you. You know, this is amazing how quickly it sets in.
So it'd be helpful if there were some experienced judges with some of the new
Like
judges.
mentor judges, just so, you know, when that starts to impact the new judges, they have somewhere to turn.
Right.
That would be good.
That is a good idea. We, in the first district, we had a mentorship with the magistrate judges who were non-lawyers, and we'd have a judge that would be assigned to us, and they would call us with legal questions when they, you know, what is contributory negligence? You'd explain it to them. And that was really helpful to them, and I think it would be helpful to new district judges. But just to have a mechanism where judges can get together outside of the court setting and talk about these issues could really help a lot of judges deal with the stresses that we have. And we sort of had it at our retreats.
Right.
But you know, probably more often than once a year would be helpful for the courts to try to get this thing going.
How would you feel about meeting with judges from other districts?
That's probably a good idea, you know. I mean, I think you may find that you're going to get more a variety of experiences or a variety of ways to deal with it that you wouldn't maybe get just from your own court. So that would be helpful. It would be particularly helpful for the poor districts that only have 1 or 2 judges in the districts. You know, it would really help them to talk to judges from other districts.
Wendy, how was this experience for you?
I think it would be great to have it formalized. It's really comforting to, you know, express a stress and have another person say, I've been through exactly the same thing. And also I think formalized might be good because it would expand the group that you talk to. There'd always be maybe one person that you would share with or 2, but you would get a broader experience if it was a little bit more formalized. And then finally, I would say just having an experience where the expectation is that you would share your feelings is good, because I think a lot of times we don't do that. We tough it out, and it takes a toll.
A lot of times judges want to get together to solve a legal issue or a procedural matter, but that's not what this is all about. This is about us as judges and our well-being. So it is important to be able to open up. Yeah. Anything else?
No?
All right. Well, thanks again for
Thank you.
participating.
Thank you.